Hi, I'm Larry Mass. I used to be known as the other Larry, Larry Kramer. And this is my book, an edited anthology of collected writings about Larry called We Must Love One Another or Die, The Life and Legacies of Larry Kramer. I'm going to just read a little bit from my introduction, a few minutes, which talks about the contents of the book and uh, its purpose and why it's relevant and you know uh, what it could mean for us. And there are a lot of well-known contributors to this volume. I'm not going to go into them all, but Andrew Holleran, Christopher Bram, lots and Tony Kushner, Anthony Fauci. I should have just had the whole list there, but there are many others of fame and renown and accomplishment. So anyway, I'm going to just go ahead and read the few paragraphs from the preface, and I'm sorry about the kind of uh, grainy visual here, but none of the other video options I used were adequate. So, all right, so here we go. Without any introduction, many will have already gleaned the thrust of this collection simply by looking at its list of contributors. Though that roster includes several distinguished AIDS activists and a number of writers who write about AIDS and are otherwise activists, it is dominated by writers. It may be true that Larry Kramer is more widely known as as an AIDS activist than as a writer per se, but the principal source of that renown has been his writing. Even his most fiery orations have caught hold primarily in their published versions as collected in Reports from the Holocaust. Now, this is written in 1997. The book this was published in 1997. Um, so the thrust, the thrust, this thrust would seem appropriate for another reason. Although there is now a consensus, whatever the caveats, about Kramer's colossal place in the history of AIDS, there has been a lot less consensus, notwithstanding his commercial success, about his place as a playwright, novelist, short story writer, essayist, and journalist in the gay as well as in the greater literary communities. Of course, it is ultimately impossible to completely disentangle the activist from the writer, just as it is inevitably impossible to completely disentangle the personal from the political in the life and work and times of Larry Kramer, certainly, as well as in our own. Just as the confrontation between Ned Weeks and his brother over what's normal is at the heart of the normal heart, the first version of Reports concludes not with Larry on Mount Olympus giving his most powerful speech to the largest crowd, but with a comparably messy, intimate, irresolute confrontation between Larry and his sister-in-law about their real feelings, attitudes, resentments, prejudices. The message is clear. Confrontation and dialogue with those closest to you is the foundation of greater change. The political begins, concludes, and must continue with the personal. Just as there is no simple linear progression of comprehension in our real lives and times, there is none in this book. There is instead a zigzagging progress in the unfolding and fleshing out of a preoccupation with the entanglement of the personal and the political. Among the themes that intermesh in this regard, but which have not been much considered heretofore, are Kramer's impact on the trajectory of the gay movement, his ethnicity as a factor in his work, viewpoints, and reception, his experience as a gay writer, his place in the history of gay and American literatures and theater, his impact on medical research, policy, and care, his work in progress. I'm going to skip the big paragraph that lists all the contributors. I don't mean to slight anybody. It's just that I don't want to make this little brief introduction, too long. And there are just too many, leading, outstanding contributors to name them all and give them all adequate credit for the wonderful contributions they've made. So I'm going to skip to the end of this preface. It seems appropriate to conclude this preface with a word about my own personal journey in the course of working on this collection. When I began my activism around the time Faggots was published, it's 1978, I believed, like most of the gay political community, that Larry was a retrogressive figure, where while we were abandoning the shrinks that had pathologized us for so long, Larry was still in therapy and working to take responsibility for what we liberationists saw so clearly as entirely the fault of society. Like an emerging consensus of others, however, I have come to realize that Larry was right about quite a bit. It wasn't all society's fault. We do have to look to ourselves and our own lives. Being responsible is a moral imperative. Meanwhile, even as I worked on this collection, I, a co-founder of GMHC and the writer of AIDS guidelines, had evaded retesting for HIV for years, finally unable to sustain the cognitive dissonance of affirming Larry's work while failing to take action with regard to my own life. I took the plunge. Getting the result was one of the most difficult and frightening experiences of my life. I don't often cry, but I did so then, not because of the result, but in relief of the fear and shame that evasion had compounded. Today, I am grateful to Larry Kramer for inspiring me to keep trying to be responsible to myself as well as my community, but most of all, for giving me the courage to keep trying to stand up to my fears, to stand up to and for myself. Larry Kramer may always be characterized as controversial. An opinion about him may always be divided. Yet there is one observation as captured by Arnie Kantrowitz in An Enemy of the People, with which we may forever concur. Where would we be without him? Arnie Kantrowitz, coincidentally, would have been 85 tomorrow. He passed away several years ago in 2021. So there you have it. Bill Goldstein is the author of forthcoming biography of Larry that's due out. And so Larry will be back in the news, presumably and hopefully forever. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to introduce myself to all of you and to some of you, to Larry Kramer. Take care.